Welcome to the Software Security Gurus webcast. I'm your host, Matias Madou, CTO and co-founder of Secure Code Warrior. This webcast is co-sponsored by Secure Code Warrior. For more information, see www.softwaresecuritygurus.com. This is the fourth in a series of interviews with security gurus, and today I'm super pleased to have with me Aaron Bedra.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Hey Aaron, do you mind sharing a few words about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Aaron Bedra. I've been working in software/security for my entire career, actually. It's kind of been a pattern of rotating in and out of security, strictly security roles and strictly software roles and combinations of the two. And I found it to be kind of my happy place in terms of what I do. I spent time as a CISO, as a CTO, as a principal engineer/architect, kind of held, I think, most of the roles in technology throughout my career. It's been fun to kind of just see what all the different roles mean and how they function and kind of collect that into a series of things to share.
Nice. So fantastic. So for today, I actually have two topics in mind, if you don't mind, and I hope they are near and dear to your heart. So the first one is around more of the regulation part, and the second one is around a holistic approach to software security. So let's start with the first one. So I think you've worked now for a decade or even more, if I'm not mistaken, into payment processing, health insurance, trading. So I think by now you've had a lot of insights on how regulators work and sometimes
Definitely.
how overzealous they are with attempting to weaken encryption, for example, in certain processes.
Yes.
So how do they stack up against each other? And let's start from the top. Let's start with Europe versus US versus Asia.
Certainly, yeah. So in terms of regulation, Europe seems to lead the charge in terms of privacy, advocating for citizens' rights to protect their data. Europe seems to be driving a lot of the personal protections, which is great. Unfortunately, application of this has been bespoke at best, I think, around, GDPR being one of the more recent pushes, where it was a great idea, but as it's unfolded, it's been hit or miss in terms of support around the world, and also really even what the legislation's been able to do across the world in terms of protecting people's data. It's made people think, which is great, and it's made companies rethink how they're storing data. I've seen and been a part of this for quite a while now. It's been nice to have folks reevaluate, be able to, as a person, request that you be forgotten, request what data people have on you. We've always known there's a lot of data about us floating around, but it's been interesting to see really how much it is now that things have surfaced. I think it helps people kind of cement the idea that digital privacy is really not much of a thing. There was a lot of expectations, a lot of assumptions, but I think this kind of now cemented that it doesn't really exist.
Yeah. And so you're saying Europe, do you mean really Europe or do you mean Germany? Because even within Europe, there's quite a difference, right?
There is, yeah. I'm not as familiar with every single country's restrictions. Usually more for me, it's the broad perspective of how I approach this when doing business or operating business in the EU. Now the EU and the UK as a separation, because even though there's still kind of an agreement in place there, things could possibly change. Thinking about that is something that I think everybody needs to be tackling not lightly before that time bomb goes off.
Yeah. And in the US, how do you look at privacy and especially I think states over there's a big difference state by state. If you look at California, I think they're maybe leading the pack in that area?
Yeah, there's quite a few states, and it depends on kind of what they're focusing on. California, Nevada, Massachusetts, there's several different states that have different types of rules. Mm-hmm. But the rules in the U.S. seem to be more focused around corporate.
Yeah.
You'll definitely find things with healthcare. The U.S. has some pretty strict healthcare rules. I think I wouldn't say the strictest, but definitely seems to be the most impactful set of rules with HIPAA. Unfortunately, they're a little bit gray there. I did spend quite a bit of time working in healthcare, and while HIPAA's rules are meant to be kind of short and sweet, they can lead a lot to interpretation, and there's no formal certification program. There are things like HITRUST and ANAC and other certification bodies that are private. And while HIPAA could fine you if you have a breach, they don't really have a way to formally certify. I think like the payment card industry has PCI certification, and it's a formal process that everybody has to go through. So HIPAA is a little gray there. But on the other side of the country, you've got the state of New York and the New York Department of Financial Services being one of the first bodies that really, really showed its teeth in terms of financial regulation and data protection. And they made a very extensive and very exhaustive list of controls based on FFIEC guidelines. And I've, obviously been a part of that working in finance. I've seen that from multiple angles now. And I think that probably has the most direct guidance of anybody I've seen so far in terms of maturity, risk measurement, completeness. PCI does have good guiding principles and, an array of interpretation left open to auditors. But I really think the NYDFS rules are more complete because they think more holistically about a lot more broad topics than PCI does.
As a technologist, is that a curse or a blessing? Because I can look at this in two ways. On the one hand, you can say, well, it's really a curse. All this regulation, it's a curse. It's stuff that we need to do on top of things. But at the same time, it can also be a blessing where you can potentially get more funding for what you're trying to achieve, and you have some things to back you up. So how do you look at that?
So holistically, I think it's a blessing.
Okay.
In a lot of ways. If you're a startup company tackling healthcare and finance, it's rough. If you're a startup in the United States and you're in one of those two places, you must secure extra funding to be able to get through this, right? Because it's not just about building this. You also have to pay for the auditing.
Yep.
And auditors are not cheap, right? It costs a lot of money to go through this. And when you're doing this, especially with a small team, it's almost everything you're doing. The amount of effort required to get through, HIPAA or HITRUST, an ISO certification, a SOC 2 Type 2 certification, the NYDFS certifications, or following those rules.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work. And I think people underestimate how much work it truly is. And for me, when I think about that, it's not how do I get through the audit? It's how do I make my company live this,
Yep.
right? If you really go all in and make it part of your company, the audits are much easier. And not just year one, but in year 5 and in year 10, it's just part of your culture,
Yep.
right? And if you make it part of your culture, it's much, much easier to just have it fall out naturally,
Yeah.
right? It's when you check the boxes and you're constantly fighting it that it becomes difficult. That's when you have gaps. That's when you lose some momentum there.
Yeah.
But for larger organizations, I think it is a way to put a little bit of structure around the security aspect of the business, especially businesses that really haven't had to focus on that much in the past.
Yep.
And I think that's really important to be able to set a little bit of foundation. And I've worked in some of those fields as well, where it wasn't natural to have information security as part of it. Yet, here the company is kind of in a new landscape trying to mature and being able to set a budget and name a CISO and have them report to the board. Those kind of natural lines of communication, when opened, I think can be healthy as long as they have the right people in place.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I much rather work with an organization where they really want to do that. They do not want to check the box, but they really want to do that. And yes, there's a regulation that backs up what they're doing, but it's much better over time. it's much better over time to do it in a decent way.
Yeah, and I do have an experience. When I was working as a CISO at Eligible, the CEO there, Caitlin, we basically stopped new feature development for the better part of 6 months just to pursue culture shifting, certification, to really dig in and re-engineer and re-architect part of the platform around the culture of security. And it was an all-in team effort to make it work. And it's serious kudos, right? To have a leader who realizes this is really crucial to move forward as a business matures and make that kind of sacrifice, that kind of choice. That's really, really interesting. And a lot of respect there to kind of push off the short-term opportunity in favor of a longer-term kind of culture and mission. And I think it really showed throughout the last few years.
Wow, that's very radical. I haven't heard about that quite often, where you really stop feature development to make sure that you have this thing right from the start, essentially.
Yeah, it was the primary effort. The best engineers in the team were involved. It was really a go all in and don't come back out until it's something that will last, which is really cool.
Very nice. Let's shift gears and let's tackle a second topic, if you don't mind. So another thing that you've been focusing on from a security perspective recently is how development teams can be more rigorous and use principled methods to create systems that can easily change. That includes testability, resistance to coupling, and defining essentially an algebra of execution that makes verification of change more tenable. So what we can best learn on how to not create vulnerable software, we will always have vulnerable software. We have to live with that. There's always going to be problems. So then it actually takes time to fix the vulnerability, but then you risk to introducing new failure, and essentially you go down the track where it can be even, you can suffer greater loss by fixing the problem than leaving it in the first place. But so how do you look at the holistic approach of drastically reducing bugs, which ultimately reduce vulnerabilities, but you take a holistic approach in reducing bugs altogether?
Yeah, really, if you think about vulnerabilities, they're bugs in software, right? And if you can do your part to reduce the amount of bugs, you'll naturally reduce the amount of vulnerabilities. But for me, it's always been and will always be a systems thinking and systems theory exercise, right? It's about how do you treat the system as a whole, not an individual component. Mm-hmm. Emergent properties sometimes are surprising, right? But rigor and discipline are the foundation of what make this work, right? Yes, sometimes you have to make something fast, right? Yes, IT is here to serve the business, right? To create function and form for the business, right? IT does not drive the business, and it can be selfish at times to go down too much of a rabbit hole. At the same time, discipline and rigor, I think, sometimes get sacrificed in favor of speed of execution.
Yep.
Things like always managing your dependencies and always updating them, right? There's probably a few companies who might have been bitten by that in the last couple of years that are very, very well known, where it's not about having that vulnerability, right? Yes, we can all do our best to not have them, but they're going to still happen, right? There's nothing we can do about that. Software will change. Every day something new comes out, and despite your best efforts, there's always going to be a vulnerability. Yep. And I think the most dangerous thing is not having vulnerabilities, because we all have them. It's the rate at which we can fix them. Right? Once we identify them, can we turn around, upgrade that dependency, get in the code and fix that thing once, right, in one place and have it naturally cascade? Or does it take us months of testing to upgrade because we're 15 versions behind, or because that one cross-site scripting vulnerability exists in 50 different places, or maybe 200 different places, because we maybe chose the wrong library, or we built our own thing, or because we mismanaged encryption, things that could be fundamental to the system that are just broken.
Yep.
And the other part is the coupling, right? Some parts of our system are so intertwined and so tangled that one small change trickles, and you have that kind of butterfly effect where everything falls apart because one thing changed. And despite our best effort, every large system, every legacy system has that one piece that everybody's scared to touch, right? And if you think about it and you look at things, that's probably where all the bugs are sitting. It's the least tested code. It's the highest churn. If you look at the chart of files versus changes in Git, it'll be the file that's changed the most often, that has the most lines of code and the worst cyclomatic complexity and the lowest test coverage, and all the things that scream red flag. That's the area where you have that. But I think the discipline of breaking it apart, of writing tests, and you mentioned defining algebra. I think that defining an algebra is very important. What you're trying to do, being able to describe what you're trying to do. I have recently been in favor of, letting the type system kind of help guide you. I don't mean to say that types are the answer for everyone. They're not. But in some ways, when you have a type system that supports it, being able to let the types drive you towards a mechanism or an algebra where you can't put the wrong thing in the wrong place, it's nice, right? It helps you kind of be a little more principled. But really, it's about that testing, right? It's about being able to put things in the right places and verify you've done so in as many ways as possible. And I think that always gets sacrificed in favor of need to get it done now. And that sloppiness is rough.
Yeah. So I checked out a video of you, a presentation that you gave a couple of years back at, I think, GoTo conference. And what you're just mentioning is like, hey, how can people do better? Like, what kind of steps do they need to take? But over there, you also pitch like, hey, we all have this monolith, and now we have to break it up into microservices. But so you've now pitched a couple ways on how to do better, how to be better in software development. But if you have a monolith today, like if there's still plenty of companies out there that just have the monolith,
Yes.
Where do you start? Where on earth do you start? Do you start with testing? Do you start with breaking out one component? I saw this really interesting graph from you where you just say, building microservices is not just take the component, put it on a different server and just connect to it. That is not building microservices. But where do you start?
Yeah. Monoliths aren't all that bad. I think it's okay to have a monolith. Mm-hmm. If your teams are struggling with delivery, if the rate of change is too slow, if you've put yourself into a place where it's too hard to move forward, then maybe it is more reasonable to break things up, right? Yep. Organizational structure could be dictating this. Team structure could be dictating this. Size of teams could be dictating this. The switch to microservices, for me, is part and parcel about agility, right? Can we do this, and can we increase our ability to change and be flexible? Yep. One of the most dangerous mistakes I see people make over and over and over again, though, is breaking that thing into multiple processes and forgetting about the substrate, right? The protocols, the latency, how things are communicated, how things fail, right? A method call is very different from a protocol exchange between two processes and two different machines, mm-hmm. right? There's so much to think about, right, in terms of failure and retry and traceability. You exponentially increase the amount of things that go wrong when you make a microservice. Yep. And that gets left on the wayside way too often. Just because HTTP and JSON are simple and there's 1,000 libraries out there that make them work does not mean it's the right choice, right? And on top of that, because HTTP is stateless, you have so much overhead every time requests are made. And I see that mistake being made over and over again. And, they're 2 years down the road and all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, this is too slow. Yeah. It's because it became so bloated with the exchange of information.
So is it correct to say that you're more advocating for first get your engineering practices up to date and make sure you can you can make quick changes? If it's a monolith or if it's microservice, it's irrelevant as long as you can write features fast that are tested in a proper way and are deployed in a reliable way. Is that correct?
Yeah. Discipline and rigor wins for me every time. It doesn't matter what language you're using. It doesn't matter what framework. It doesn't matter whether they're microservices or monoliths. All that stuff is a matter of how your team prefers to function and how they're optimally performing, right? That's more of a who wants to do what, right? Maybe you have a team of people who some like Java and some like C# and some like Haskell and some like Clojure. That's fine, right? It doesn't matter. You let people be as productive in whatever environment they can be productive in. I think it's really about how disciplined can everybody be in the process, and how confident can they be in delivery. I currently work in an industry, in trading, where mistakes, incorrectness can cost a lot of money, right? And so discipline and rigor is really, really important to me and my team as we're working on things. And so, that's part of culture, right? And I think that's the other thing is that this stuff can't just be a poster on a wall, a motivational statement. It has to be something that the team lives and breathes every single day.
Especially in your area, I remember that QA server that they didn't update, one of your, I think, former competitors, where they didn't update one of their servers. 1 out of 8 servers wasn't updated, and they did random trades, and ultimately that company went under.
Oh, I think you're probably speaking of the of the Night Capital incident.
Can't remember. It's a couple of years ago.
Very costly mistakes can happen. And not something I'll comment too much on in that particular case. However, there's a lot of information out there that's publicly available, the cost of mistakes can be high if left unchecked.
Yes. Last question for you, Aaron. Maybe a personal one, but I know you're into barbecuing, and is barbecuing without a big green egg, is that the real barbecuing or is that not real barbecuing?
I think anything can be real barbecuing. I like the egg. I think it's pretty great. It's kind of like cheating. I do quite a bit of that. But it's definitely fun, especially when we're kind of all at home and nowhere to go. You need something to keep you busy.
Yeah, I saw a couple pictures from you in the last couple of weeks with that big green egg. So yes, clearly it keeps you busy.
Yes, keeps you full too.
Aaron, thank you very, very much to be the 4th guru on the Software Security Webcast. It was absolutely a fantastic chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, man.